Under the burning sun of North Africa, where the horizon trembles like fire and the earth turns to dust, there stood a fortress, defiant, isolated, and vital. Its name was Tobruk, a small port city carved into the Libyan coast, once an outpost of empires, now the center of a struggle that would test the courage of men and the endurance of nations. It was here, between April 1941 and November 1942, that soldiers from across the world would fight, starve, bleed, and hold their ground against one of history's most formidable enemies, the German Afrika Korps, led by Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox. But before Tobruk became legend, the desert had already begun to burn. When Italy entered the war in 1940, North Africa became the new front. Benito Mussolini dreamed of empire, of recreating Rome's dominance over the Mediterranean. From Libya, Italian forces struck east into Egypt, threatening the Suez Canal, Britain's lifeline to India and beyond. But the dream quickly faltered. In December 1940, the British launched Operation Compass, a bold counter-offensive led by General Richard O'Connor. In just weeks, the British and Commonwealth troops smashed through Italian lines, captured tens of thousands, and advanced deep into Libya. By February 1941, they had reached El Agheila, deep inside Italian territory. But victory came with a price. Britain was stretched thin, called to fight in Greece, and O'Connor's advance stalled. In the vacuum, Germany sent help, the Afrika Korps, commanded by a man who would redefine desert warfare. Erwin Rommel arrived in Tripoli in February 1941 with orders only to stabilize the front. But Rommel was not a man who waited. Within days he began his counter-offensive, swift, decisive, unpredictable. The German tanks, Panzer III and IVs, cut across the desert like lightning. The British, caught off guard and under strength, fell back in disarray. Within weeks, Axis forces swept east, recapturing El Agheila, Mersa Brega, and Agadabia. By early April, the British were retreating toward Egypt, all except one isolated garrison that refused to yield, Tobruk. Tobruk was no ordinary port, a deep natural harbor surrounded by rocky escarpments and open desert, easy to defend, difficult to assault. Its defenses, built by the Italians before the war, were formidable: concrete bunkers, trenches, and barbed wire, all encircled by a ring of anti-tank ditches. Inside were about 25,000 men, mostly Australians of the 9th Division, supported by British artillery, engineers, and Indian troops. Their commander, Lieutenant General Leslie Morshead, a strict, unyielding leader the men called Ming the Merciless. But under his command, Tobruk would become a symbol of defiance. On April 10, 1941, the first German units appeared on the ridges west of Tobruk. Rommel expected the fortress to fall quickly, just another stop on his road to Egypt. But what he found was something entirely different. The defenders opened fire the moment German reconnaissance appeared. The first attacks were repelled with heavy losses. For the next days, Rommel launched repeated assaults, tanks charging headlong into anti-tank zones, infantry advancing through blinding sandstorms. Each time the defenders held firm. Artillery from British 25-pounders thundered across the desert, while Bren gun crews raked German positions. The Australian infantry, tough, sarcastic, and fearless, earned their nickname, the Rats of Tobruk. It was a name given to them mockingly by Nazi propaganda, but they embraced it as a badge of honor. As April turned to May, Tobruk was surrounded on all sides. The garrison was cut off by land, supplied only by sea through the Royal Navy's daring nightly runs. Ships slipped into the harbor under darkness, unloading ammunition, food, and fuel, then taking out the wounded under constant air attack. Inside the perimeter, life was harsh. The desert sun scorched by day, the cold bit hard by night. Dust-choked lungs, flies swarmed over everything, and water was rationed by the pint. Shellfire never stopped, yet morale held. They built dugouts, carved sleeping quarters into the rocky soil, and painted sardonic slogans on the walls. "This is Tobruk Hilton," one sign read. Private Stanley Thompson of the 2/13th Battalion wrote in his diary, "We've become moles. We dig, we fight, we sweat, but we hold and hold," they did. By June, Rommel's patience began to crack. His supply lines stretched thin across hundreds of miles of desert. Each attack cost precious fuel and men he could not replace. The Germans brought in 88mm guns, deadly against armor and fortifications alike. They hammered the defenses for weeks, but the Rats endured. A counterattack by the Royal Navy and RAF made resupply even harder for the Axis. By July, the siege had turned into a war of attrition, and Tobruk had become a thorn in Rommel's side. Across the Allied world, Tobruk became a beacon of resistance. In London, Churchill hailed its defenders. Newspapers called it the fortress that would not fall. Back home in Australia, families followed every headline. The Rats of Tobruk became national heroes, a living reminder that the tide could still turn. But the siege was far from over. The heat, the hunger, the unending shelling all began to take their toll. And while the defenders dug deeper, Rommel was planning again. He would not allow this fortress to defy him forever. The Desert War had entered a new phase, one of endurance, ingenuity, and vengeance. And as the summer of 1941 burned across Libya, both sides prepared for the next great test. Tobruk had survived the storm, but the true siege was only beginning. By June 1941, Tobruk had been under siege for 2 long months. The men in the trenches no longer measured time by the calendar, but by the number of bombardments in a day, the nights without sleep, and the convoys that did, or didn't, make it through the blockade. The siege had settled into a grim rhythm. Every sunrise brought the scream of Stuka dive bombers. Every sunset came with the rumble of artillery across the dunes. Between them, life in the fortress was a blur of dust, sweat, and exhaustion. Rommel was determined to crush Tobruk once and for all. He reinforced his lines with new tanks from Tripoli, Panzer III and IV models, and strengthened his artillery positions. On June 20th, he launched a renewed assault on the western perimeter. Waves of German infantry advanced under covering fire, while tanks probed for weak points in the defences. But the Australians and British defenders met them with disciplined fury. Anti-tank guns concealed behind ridges opened fire at point-blank range. German armour burned on the slopes of Hill 209 and along the Via Balbia. When the smoke cleared, hundreds of Axis soldiers lay dead or captured. Rommel withdrew, furious and incredulous. What he had dismissed as a minor outpost had turned into a fortress of defiance. Inside the garrison, the men were worn thin but unbroken. Supplies came only by sea, brought by ships that braved the gauntlet of Luftwaffe attacks. Every night, destroyers such as HMS Nizam, Stuart, and Voyager slipped into Tobruk harbour under blackout. They unloaded ammunition, rations, and mail, and carried out the wounded and the dead. The men called these runs the Tobruk Ferry Service. Each journey was an act of courage. The Mediterranean was alive with German bombers, and many ships never returned, yet the lifeline never stopped. By midsummer, the garrison was a multinational force. Australians, British, Indians, Poles, and even a handful of Czech volunteers. The defences were divided into sectors, each manned by a battalion that knew every inch of its ground. They built fake guns from logs to deceive enemy aircraft, and moved real guns nightly to keep the Germans guessing. To the outside world, Tobruk became a legend. Churchill praised the defenders in Parliament, calling their stand an inspiration to free men everywhere. But for the men inside there was no romance, only survival. The heat rose to over 100 degrees by day. The trenches stank of sweat, gunpowder, and decay. Flies covered every wound, every ration tin, every sleeping man. Dysentery spread, rations dwindled. Bread was replaced by hard biscuits that shattered like rock. Still, the morale held. The men joked, carved signs into the earth, and turned mockery into defiance. They sang songs about Ming the Merciless and the Tobruk Hilton. They made a hellish world bearable with humour. By late July, Rommel realized that brute force would not take Tobruk. He shifted his focus eastward, striking at the Egyptian frontier. Battles flared at Sollum, Halfaya Pass, and Bardia. The siege lines at Tobruk thinned, but the fortress remained surrounded. For the Allies, the situation was desperate. Reinforcements from Britain were limited, and the Eighth Army in Egypt was barely holding the line. Yet behind the scenes a plan was forming, one that would attempt to break the siege and drive Rommel back. It would be called Operation Crusader. In November 1941, the British Eighth Army launched the offensive. The attack began across the barren Libyan desert, hundreds of tanks, thousands of men advancing in swirling sand. Rommel responded with his trademark speed, counter-attacking at Sidi Rezek and Bir el Gubi. The fighting was brutal and chaotic. For days, neither side knew who held the advantage. But slowly the British advance began to succeed. Rommel's lines stretched too far. His fuel ran low, and as the Eighth Army pushed west, the siege ring around Tobruk began to crack. Inside the fortress, the garrison could hear the thunder of battle in the distance. Radio operators intercepted frantic German messages. the defenders were ordered to prepare for a breakout. On November 21st, the men of the 71st Division and the Polish Carpathian Brigade launched their assault from inside Tobruk's perimeter. They attacked the German positions at Ed Duda and El Duda in a storm of artillery and bayonets. The fighting was savage, trench to trench, gun to gun, in clouds of dust and smoke. By nightfall, the defenders had seized the key ridges overlooking the German lines. For the first time in 8 months, Allied forces outside Tobruk linked up with those within. The siege was broken. When the British columns entered Tobruk on December 10th, 1941, the men of the garrison were gaunt, sunburned, and hollow-eyed, but triumphant. They had held out for 241 days, longer than anyone had believed possible. Churchill called it one of the most glorious chapters in the annals of war. Yet even as the defenders celebrated, the desert was not done with them. Rommel, ever resilient, regrouped. By early 1942, the Afrika Korps struck back with new ferocity, sweeping eastward once again. And in the months ahead, the fortress that had defied him for so long would once again find itself in the crosshairs of the Desert Fox. The men of Tobruk had endured the first siege, but a second was already waiting beyond the horizon. The winter of 1941 gave the men of Tobruk a brief moment of peace. The siege was lifted, supplies poured in, ships once again entered the harbor without fear of air attack. But in war, peace is only an illusion, and in North Africa illusions vanish with the desert wind. By early 1942, Rommel had recovered from his defeat. Reinforcements and supplies flowed in from Italy, and with them a renewed determination to strike back. The Afrika Korps was rebuilt, stronger, faster, and more dangerous than ever before. In January, he launched Operation Theseus, his counter-offensive across Cyrenaica. British positions, still reorganizing after Crusader, were caught off guard. One by one, the 8th Army outposts fell: Gazala, Machili, Benghazi. Each position collapsed under the relentless push of German armor. By May 1942, the front lines once again approached Tobruk. The fortress that had defied Rommel the year before now stood as the last bastion before Egypt. Inside Tobruk, the garrison was different this time. The veteran Australians had been withdrawn. In their place stood newly arrived British, Indian, and South African troops. Brave men, but unfamiliar with the defenses that had once held so firm. Rommel's reputation had grown. He was no longer the daring newcomer of 1941, but the Desert Fox, a legend among his men and a nightmare to his enemies. On May 26, 1942, Rommel struck again. His forces attacked along the Gazala line west of Tobruk, seeking to outflank the British defenses. In a maneuver that would later be called the left hook, he drove his armor south through the desert, then wheeled north behind Allied lines. For days, the battle raged in the sands, confused, brutal, and unforgiving. British tanks fought valiantly, but were overwhelmed by Rommel's speed and coordination. The sky was filled with the drone of Stukas and the thunder of tank guns. By June 13th, the British line at Gazala collapsed. The remnants of the 8th Army began a desperate retreat east toward Egypt, and Tobruk once again stood alone, but this time it would not endure. Rommel moved fast. He encircled Tobruk from the south and east, cutting off every route of escape. He massed over 200 tanks, hundreds of guns, and thousands of men for the assault. Inside the fortress, General Klopper commanded around 35,000 defenders. They had food and ammunition, but not the time to prepare the elaborate defenses of 1941. At dawn on June 20th, 1942, the Axis artillery opened fire. Over 500 guns roared in unison, blasting the southern perimeter of the fortress. Stukas screamed down in waves, their bombs turning trenches into craters. Then came the tanks, columns of panzers advancing through smoke and dust. The defenders fought desperately. Anti-tank crews fired until their guns overheated. Infantrymen clung to shattered walls, repelling attacks with rifles and grenades. But Rommel's assault was concentrated, overwhelming, and relentless. By afternoon, the Axis had broken through the outer defenses. German and Italian infantry poured into the city's outskirts. The harbor burned. Ammunition depots exploded. The radio crackled with confusion and despair. By nightfall, Rommel's troops were in the heart of Tobruk. The defenders were exhausted, their lines shattered, their command uncertain. On June 21st, less than 24 hours after the attack began, General Klopper surrendered. Tobruk, once a symbol of Allied defiance, had fallen. more than 33,000 Allied soldiers marched into captivity. Hundreds of guns, tanks, and vehicles were captured intact. For Rommel, it was the greatest victory of his career. Hitler promoted him to Field Marshal that same day, the youngest in the German army. For Churchill, the news was devastating. He called it a shattering disaster. The fall of Tobruk opened the road to Egypt. Within weeks, Rommel's advance reached El Alamein, just 60 miles from Alexandria. The fate of the Middle East hung in the balance, but from defeat the Allies would rise again. Reinforcements poured in. A new commander, General Bernard Montgomery, would soon take charge of the Eighth Army, and at El Alamein the tide of the Desert War would turn for good. Tobruk had fallen, but its legend would never die. The courage of those who fought, endured, and perished in that fortress became part of the story of human endurance, proof that even in the darkest hours of war, the will to resist can outlast stone and steel. The desert keeps its secrets, but in the shifting sands of North Africa, the story of Tobruk still whispers. Through rusted wire, broken gun pits, and the sun-bleached bones of men who once called this place hell on earth. For 8 long months in 1941, Tobruk stood as a symbol of defiance, a fortress battered by the full might of the Axis war machine, yet unbroken. Australian, British, Indian, and Polish soldiers held the line against Rommel's fury, proving that courage could outlast fear and endurance could outshine despair. Their victory was not in conquest, but in resistance. Every shell fired, every trench dug, every night survived beneath the endless bombing raids, was a small act of defiance that changed the rhythm of the Desert War. The siege of Tobruk tied down Rommel's forces, delayed his advance toward Egypt, and gave the Allies time to rebuild. It became a rallying cry, a name that inspired men across the British Empire and beyond. But in 1942 Tobruk fell. The same walls that had once defied the Desert Fox could not withstand his renewed assault, and yet, even in defeat, its legend only grew stronger. The men who endured Tobruk carried the memory for the rest of their lives. They remembered the dust that never left their lungs, the constant scream of Stukas above, the nights when tracer fire stitched across the horizon like red lightning, and the comrades who never came home. One Australian veteran later wrote, "We were called the rats of Tobruk. We wore it like a badge of honor, because rats survive, rats endure." That endurance became the soul of the Allied spirit in North Africa. When the Eighth Army regrouped at El Alamein, it was built upon the same defiance that had held Tobruk. And when the guns thundered again in 1942, the tide finally turned, not just for the desert, but for the entire war. The fall of Tobruk was not the end of its story. It was a chapter in something far greater, the story of ordinary men standing against impossible odds. From the harbor ruins to the desert graves, the legacy of Tobruk is written not in victory, but in endurance, not in conquest, but in courage. Today, the fortress stands quiet. The bunkers still scar the landscape. The harbor lies still beneath the desert sun, but if you listen to the wind, you can almost hear them still. The voices of men who fought, bled, and endured on the edge of the world. Tobruk, a fortress of sand and steel, a monument to defiance, and a reminder that even in war's darkest shadow, humanity endures.